No, we don't get to come up with our own plan. We don't get to come up with our own conclusion, our own decisions. We have to walk in the will of God, and we have to be focused on God and not on people. Today we're talking about being delivered from people. And if we can get this message, you would find that your walk with God would be a whole lot easier. Amen. So now we see already that Samuel has let Saul know that because of his decision, it says your kingdom's not going to continue. Now the Lord sought him a man after his own heart. The Lord has commanded him to be captain over his people. It says, look, since you decided that you were going to do the opposite of what God told you to because of people, that was always Saul's excuse. People. So since you want to blend in with the people, since you were afraid of the people, since you want to please the people, since it's always about the people, God can't really use you. Because when you find out when you're listening to God and you obey his commands, then whatever it is that you do with people ends up being for the people's own good and for your own good. But when you're looking to the people and that's how you make your decisions, you always make the wrong decision. Amen. So let's look at chapter 15 while we're just in 1 Samuel here. Look at chapter 15. In verse 1, it says, Samuel also said unto Saul, the Lord sent me to anoint you to be king over his people, over Israel. Now therefore, hearken now unto the voice of the words of the Lord. Thus saith the Lord of hosts, I remember that which Amalek did to Israel. Now he laid wait for him in the way, when he came up from Egypt. Now go and smite Amalek, and utterly destroy what? All that they have, and spare them not, but slay both man and woman, infant and suckling, ox and sheep, camel and ass. Well, now what are they supposed to leave? Nothing. Amen. Look down at verse 9. Verse 9 says, but Saul and the people spared Agag and the best of the sheep and of the oxen and of the fatling and of the lambs and all that was good, and would not utterly destroy them. But everything that was vile and refuse, that they destroyed utterly. Did Saul do what God told him to do? No, he didn't, because God told him to destroy what? All. And what's left after all? Nothing. But they spared the king and the good animals and the good stuff. And so when we look down just a little bit further, go down to verse 24. We're still in 1 Samuel chapter 15. Verse 24, he is now confronted by Samuel. And Samuel lets him know, all right. Amen, that he sinned. He let him know that you didn't do what God told you to do. He said, I did do what God told me to do. He said, you didn't do what God told you to do. And he began to talk about how they had kept these animals for a sacrifice. And Samuel told him, behold, to obey is better than sacrifice. So in verse 24 it says, and Saul said unto Samuel, I have sinned, for I have transgressed the commandment of the Lord and thy words, because I what? Feared the people, and obeyed what? Whose voice? The people's voice. He says, I feared the people and obeyed their voice. Not I have a reverential fear for God and he gave me instructions and so I feared God and obeyed his voice, but I feared the people and I obeyed their voice. In verse 25 it says, now therefore I pray thee, pardon my sin and turn again with me that I may worship the Lord. And Samuel said unto Saul, I will not return with thee, for you have rejected the word of the Lord, and the Lord has rejected you from being king over Israel. This is what happens when we're not delivered from people. People begin to dictate what you do, how you act, what you say, and decisions that you make. Every day, we have decisions to make. And every day, even though we're fighting against the enemy, even though we fight against our flesh, we also have a battle that we all have to win, and that's to be delivered from people, because every day God is speaking to us individually as a body of believers. He gives us instruction in our life, in our family, and the things that we do, the things that we need to do. Every day, every minute of every day, we get to choose if we're going to obey God or not. And when we are not delivered from people, we are always trying to impress them, trying to get accepted by them. We want them to like us. We want to fit in. We're fearful of them. We don't want them to leave us. We don't want them to talk about us. We don't want them to reject us. But guess what? When we're so focused on people not rejecting us, we get rejected by God. Amen. Saul was rejected by God. God had chosen him. He was the first king of Israel. He was anointed to be king. Not only did he mess up the first time, but then now we see right here in chapter 15 that he does the same thing again. He disobeys the voice of the Lord, the word of the Lord, and does his own thing. Amen. And so he's rejected by God. And now Samuel is saying, look, he wants a man after his own heart. He told him back in chapter 13, he found somebody after his own heart. So in chapter 16, we go and we see that in verse 6, chapter 16, 1 Samuel, in chapter 16, verse 6, this is after Samuel was sent to Jesse's house. God told him, go to Jesse's house. I want you to anoint the next king. Now, King Saul is still king. But see, God already knows ahead of time who he's going to choose to do what. Sometimes God will let us know that we've been chosen to do something, or we've been gifted to do something, or we have a calling to do something. And it may be years before you actually walk in that calling. It may be, Joseph had a dream, but it took him 13 years to get there. Abraham was given a promise, but it was 25 years before he saw it. But the thing is that here, God is sending Samuel to go anoint the next king. He tells him, go to Jesse's house, one of his sons. I'm going to use them. They're going to be the next king. And so in verse 6 it says, it came to pass when they were come that he looked on Eliab and said, surely the Lord's anointed is before me. Now this is the eldest of Jesse's sons. So Samuel looks at Eliab and says, this got to be him. He looked like a king. And so in verse 7 it says, but the Lord said unto Samuel, look not on his countenance or on the height of his stature, because I have what? I have refused him. For the Lord seeth not as man seeth, for a man looks on the outward appearance, but the Lord looks on the heart. He looks on the heart. So now God knows something about us that other people don't know. You can look like you're holy. You can look like you should have the position. You may look like you should be doing what somebody else is doing. But God is looking at your heart. And the word tells us in Proverbs that it's God who puts up and it's God who sits down. And so we have to remember that when God puts somebody up, he has a reason. He can see some stuff we can't see. Amen. The word tells us that our hearts are wicked. Is that what the word says? Amen. God knows our heart. And when you talk about the heart, you're talking about the core of a person. You're talking about their beliefs. You're talking about what they'll do in trouble. You're talking about, when you look at the word heart, one of the definitions is bravery. If you're courageous, God knows if somebody's heart will be able to stand. If you'll stand when the battle comes. If you'll be able to stand on his word when trouble comes. If you'll be able to obey him when everybody else is not obeying him. If you'll continue to do what he says to do, even if it doesn't look like it makes sense. He looks at the heart and see if you're going to stand. He looks at the core of who we are. He looks at our thoughts and our intentions. And only God knows what they are. Amen. So he says, no, I've rejected Eliab. He may look like a king, but he ain't one. And so we know the story that he went through. Samuel went through every son, and there was no. Looked like all the sons were taken care of. But then finally, Samuel asked Jesse, do you have another kid? And he said, well, we got the little ruddy boy out there taking care of the sheep. Little David's outside. That's the one. I want the one that's out there tending to the sheep. I want the little one. I want the young one. I want the one that I know his heart. He has a heart. He says he's a man after God's own heart. God knew this when David was a kid, that he was going to have a heart that was like God's heart, that he was going to focus on God and not on people, that he was going to obey what God told him to do and not be a people pleaser and not try to fit in with people and not worry about if he's accepted by people. This was the difference between Saul and between Saul and David, and it's a huge difference. It's a mighty difference. If you look at people that try to please